Michael said it first, though he never meant for anyone else to hear it. You can still see the way his lips moved when the question slipped out, low and uneven, as if his own voice was betraying him. Asterisk, what if the books remember us more than we remember them? You don't realize until later that no one in the cafe looked up. No one even blinked, except her, the girl in the corner, the one he always teased for sitting alone with a paperback. Her eyes lifted over the spine, slow, like someone answering a secret knock. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She just looked at him, like she'd been waiting years for someone reckless enough to ask. And you need to understand something before we go further this. IS&T, the kind of story people repeat out loud, it doesn't spread in whispers. It doesn't show up on news feeds. It doesn't even survive in memory the way it should. It stays where it began, locked to the eyes that dared to see it. That's why you feel it pressing against you now. As if you've opened a drawer labeled private and found something breathing inside. She turned a page then, slowly, though she hadn't read a single word. The sound of paper carried louder than it should have, and someone 2 tables away stiffened like a cold draft had touched their spine. Michael tried to laugh it off, mumbling something about asterisk nerds hiding from the world. But his voice didn't reach his own ears the way it should. It was drowned out by another sound, the tiniest hum. Not music, not static, but a syllable, spoken backward. He looked around. No one reacted. No one except the baby in the stroller by the door. Its head tilted, and with lips too new for language, it formed a name. Not his, not hers, but the name of someone neither of them had ever mentioned. Someone who had been dead for 40 years. Michael froze. The girl shut her book and laid it face down on the table. That was the first moment he realized something had broken. Not in the world, not even in the cafe, but in him. Because when he reached for the book, she left behind. Every word on the page had already been written in his own handwriting. And the last line, underlined twice, was not a line at all. It was a date, a place, and a warning. Tomorrow. His street. His door. Would you like me to continue this moment into the next scene, where Michael starts questioning whether the handwriting is his or whether someone has been inside his memory before he even lived it? Michael stared at the book as if it were a mirror that had turned against him. The handwriting wasn't just similar, it was exact, down to the uneven curve of his R's, the way his T's slashed too hard, impatient and heavy. His first thought wasn't fear, but something smaller, meaner. Asterisk. Did someone follow me? Did someone watch me? Right? Yet no memory came, no moment of scribbling notes, no drunken half-dream where he might have left himself a message. The day tomorrow. The place his own street. The warning so simple and raw, it didn't need words, only the press of underlines cutting into paper like wounds. When he looked up, the cafe had shifted. Not the walls, not the chairs, not the light streaming in from the half-fogged windows. It was the sound. Everything too clear, too sharp, every scrape of a spoon and rustle of a jacket happening a second late. As if the room were replaying itself half a breath behind. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, told himself it was fatigue, stress, another long night, staring at screens until his thoughts frayed. But then, his phone vibrated. He pulled it out, expecting nothing, just a notification or junk mail. But the screen was already open, his voice memo app glowing in the palm of his hand. A file had been recorded 10 minutes earlier. 10 minutes he had no memory of. His finger trembled as he hit play. At first it was static, the low hiss of a mic left open. Then came breathing, his own, heavy, uneven. And then words, whispered as though he were speaking into the dark, confessing something no one else was meant to hear. Asterisk, she knew I'd find it. She's not reading it. Not for her. It's for me! And I can't stop it now. I can't stop it now. I can't asterisk. The audio cut off with a click. Michael's stomach turned. He hadn't said that. He couldn't have. He'd been sitting here, watching her, watching the girl with the book. But the timestamp didn't lie. He checked it again, over and over, like numbers could bend if he stared hard enough. It said what it said. 10:43 a.m. 10 minutes ago. While he was watching her turn a page she never read, his own voice had been somewhere else already unraveling. And here's the part no one ever tells you. The part that splits people open. When you're faced with something that makes no sense, your brain doesn't scream. It doesn't sound alarms. It whispers. It tells you to keep going, to stay still, to blend in until the danger Michael forced himself to slip the phone back in his pocket, forced his breath into something steady, forced his eyes toward the girl's abandoned seat. Sit. The book was gone. Not just good. The table was bare, not even a condensation ring or crumb left behind, as though she had never been there. That was when he noticed the man sitting at the far end of the cafe, back to the window, hands folded too neatly in front of him. He wasn't drinking anything. He wasn't eating. He wasn't even looking at Michael! But Michael felt it anyway. The weight of eyes, not directly on him, but hovering. Like someone waiting for him to make the first move. The man's clothes were ordinary: a gray jacket, a collared shirt, nothing worth a second glance. But ordinary was what made him wrong. He looked borrowed, like someone had dressed themselves in an idea of normal and hedonity. Quite gotten the fit right. Michael stood, telling himself he'd leave, telling himself he'd laugh about this later, that it was nothing. Stress, paranoia, too much caffeine. But as he walked past the man, his phone buzzed again. This time, not a memo, a text from a number he didn't recognize. One word. Sit. And his body obeyed before his mind did. His knees bent. His hands lowered. He sat back down, as if the command had bypassed thought entirely. The man finally looked up. His eyes weren't threatening. They were worse. They were tired. As if he'd been through this 100 times, and none of it had ever ended well. He leaned in slightly, not enough for anyone else to notice, and said the kind of thing you don't forget. The kind of thing that doesn't even sound real when you repeat it later. Asterisk, you heard the baby, didn't you? Michael's mouth went dry. He hadn't told anyone. He hadn't even processed it fully himself. Yet here, this man was voicing the one detail no one else could have known. He wanted to deny it, wanted to push back, but the words came anyway. What name did you hear? The man didn't answer. He smiled, slow, weary, like a teacher watching a child solve a problem he'd hoped they'd never notice. And then he said, asterisk, that depends. How much of this do you think is yours? It was such a simple question, but it split Michael in half. Because suddenly he wasn't sure. The handwriting, the memo, the missing book, the baby's voice. How much of it belonged to him? How much had been put there, planted, threaded through his memory like wires, and the thought he couldn't push away. Maybe he had been here before. Maybe this wasn't the first time. Outside, the street shifted in his vision, the cars parked along the curb, flickering for a second, like bad reception. He blinked, and they were steady again. But his pulse wouldn't calm. He remembered something, then not a memory. Not exactly, but the shape of one. Sitting in this same cafe with someone else. Some other stranger leaning forward to whisper. Asterisk, you heard the baby, didn't you? Michael pressed his hands to his head, searching for the seam where reality had torn, waiting for the sound of sirens or laughter or something to break it apart. But the cafe hummed on. Ordinary. Unshaken. People laughed. Coffee machines hissed. And yet, under it all, faint and broken, his phone began to play another recording on its own. His own voice again. Don't trust the second one! The man across from him smiled wider. And Michael realized, with a sickness that felt older than him, that he had no idea which one was the second. Would you like me to build the paranoia further by showing Michael trying to escape only to find his apartment already knows what he is about to do? Michael told himself the nightmare had already peaked that, the strange girl, the baby's voice, the man in the cafe, the recordings on his phone. Those were the cracks, the breaks, the bleeding edge of some temporary madness that he could eventually explain away. He walked out into the evening air with the shaky triumph of someone who had survived a near accident. His chest hurt, but he was breathing. His mind felt scrambled, but intact. By the time he reached his apartment door, he had decided on the story he'd tell himself. Stress, fatigue, loneliness. Too many hours staring at documents and screens until his sense of reality frayed. It was easier that way, to call it exhaustion instead of intrusion, to give it a name that doctors could treat rather than a force that had no face. The false calm that wrapped him then felt like resolution, like he had reached the other side of the panic. He cooked himself something simple, pasta oversalted and clumped, but real food nonetheless. He showered until the steam burned. He played music too loud, trying to drown out the hum that had followed him from the cafe. And when he finally sat down, dampered and exhausted, he told himself the handwriting in that book wasn't his at all. It was coincidence. People shared handwriting quirks. It had to be coincidence. His phone was buggy. The recording app must have glitched. Maybe it picked up background audio without him realizing. He thought these things with the desperation of someone rehearsing lines for a part he didn't believe in. But by midnight, he almost convinced himself. Almost. Because that's when he found the box. It wasn't hidden? That was the worst part. It was sitting in plain sight, on top of the bookshelf where dust had collected in thick layers. A cardboard box, taped once, edges fraying. Nothing remarkable. Yet Michael couldn't remember putting it there. Couldn't remember ever seeing it before. And when he reached for it, the weight was wrong. To light, like it was empty. Except it wasn't. Inside were notebooks. 3 of them. Cheap spirals with covers bent and ink bleeding through the pages. He recognized the first one instantly. It was his. The handwriting was his. The lists were his. Notes from years ago when he'd still been in college. Scrawled reminders and unfinished drafts of essays. But the further he flipped, the stranger it became. His notes gave way to lines he didn't remember writing. Questions. Repeated dozens of times. Sometimes covering entire pages. Asterisk. What did you hear first? What did you hear first? What did you hear first? Asterisk. The second notebook wasn't his at all. The handwriting was different. Smaller. Neater. A woman's hand, he thought. Pages filled with fragmented sentences, but always circling the same theme. Memory glitch, hidden truth, not crazy. They lied. The repetition felt obsessive. The ink pressed hard enough to tear the paper. He flipped faster, panic rising, until he found a page that stopped him cold. His own name, written over and over, surrounded by dates that hadn't happened yet. Tomorrow's date was there. The third notebook was the one that shattered him, because it was empty, every page blank except for the last one. On the last page, there was a single sentence written in that same weary handwriting he'd seen in the Cafe Manus notes. You believed this before. Michael dropped the book. His breath came fast and shallow. He told himself again and again it was impossible that someone had planted them. That he wasn't crazy. That there had to be a logical explanation. But in the corner of his eye, the blank television screen flickered. He turned toward it slowly, dread growing before his vision caught up. The TV had turned on by itself. No sound. Just static. But buried in the static, he saw something: shapes, faces, fragments. Himself, sitting on the very same couch, staring into the screen. The image was grainy, broken, but unmistakable. He watched his reflection lean forward, press a hand against the glass, and whisper something. He couldn't hear the words, but his chest tightened as though he already knew what they were. And then, without warning, the reflection froze. It stayed still while he kept breathing, kept moving, like the recording had detached from reality. His reflection's eyes locked onto his, and then the audio cut back in, not through the speakers, but from inside the room, behind him, beside him, everywhere at once. His own voice, raw and shaking, repeating the same phrase from the notebook. You believed this before! Michael staggered backward. His phone buzzed on the table. He grabbed it, desperate for proof, for anything tangible. A new message waited, from no number. A photo. He opened it with shaking hands. It was a picture of him as a child. But not just any moment. Was one he'd buried, one he'd never told anyone. The backyard of his parents' old house? The red tricycle tipped over on the grass. And there, at the edge of the frame, the corner of a shadow too tall to be his mother, too close to be his father. He remembered crying that day, running inside, insisting to his parents that someone had been standing by the fence. They had told him it was nothing, a neighbor, a trick of light. And for years, he had let himself believe that. But here it was, photographed, undeniable. Proof of something he'd carried as unease his entire life. It hit him then. What was happening now wasn't new. It was the continuation of something older, deeper. A cycle he'd been inside of before. The notebooks. The recordings! The girl with the book! The man in the cafe. All of it circling back to that same shadow that had been there when he was a boy. And yet just as quickly the illusion of resolution appeared. He thought he understood now. This was memory. Trauma. A hidden truth resurfacing. He wasn't cursed. He wasn't losing his mind. He was recovering what had been stolen from him. The handwriting, the voices, the flickering screens. It was his subconscious forcing him to remember. And if he faced it, if he dug far enough, maybe he could end it. He clung to that thought like a drowning man grabbing driftwood. He grabbed the photo, stared hard at the shadow in the background, convinced he could finally name it, define it, pin it down. But as he zoomed closer, as the pixels stretched into nothing, he saw a detail that made his blood run cold. The hand resting on the fence in the background. It wasn't a stranger's. It wasn't a neighbor's. It was his adult hand. Scar on the knuckle, wrist bone, sharp and familiar. He hadn't been photographed. He had been there, watching himself. The resolution shattered in an instant. Nothing was solved. Nothing was recovered. The truth he thought he'd uncovered had only folded in on itself, mocking him. And as the static on the TV screen surged louder, filling the apartment like a storm, he felt it clearly for the first time. Something had been watching from the very beginning. Not outside, not above, but inside. And the last thought before the lights in the room cut out entirely was the one that forced every rewatch of his memory, every scene of his own life to play differently. Asterisk, if it has been me all along, then which one of us is real? Do you want me to continue into chapter 4 by letting Michael confront his other self directly, only to realize the confrontation might be staged for him by something else? Michael thought he was alone until he heard a name whispered back at him through someone else. S-dream, a syllable folded into the sleep of a woman 2 states away that called out like a breadcrumb trail across years. At first it came as rumor. A message board thread with a screenshot of a cafe receipt stamped with a symbol D, never seen before, a smear that looked like a coffee ring shaped into a glyph, a crooked line and a dot that somehow fit into the corner of every photograph of him that had been leaked, altered, or found. Michael felt a terrible comfort and the distinct horror that he was now part of something too large and too careful to be random. Communication, if you could call it that, began to look like an architecture of echoes. People left clues for one another, not in plain language. And a single online chat room became a mosaic of testimonies where people traded fragments. One had a voicemail of a child naming a stranger. S-name, another had footage of a TV that turned on to static with the glyph burning in the corner. Another shared a grocery receipt with a sequence of numbers that translated via a code some user had devised into coordinates that pointed to an abandoned lot where a rusting swing set bore deep gouges in the metal in the exact curvature of that glyph. And when all these traces lined up, they looked like communication, like somebody or something was systematically leaving a breadcrumb trail for those who were already awake enough to look. Into this crawlspace of half-truths and unsteady evidence stepped a new voice. a man who called himself Henry and who claimed to have been following these patterns long before Michael knew the word glyph existed. Henry spoke in paragraphs that felt like someone trying to narrate a nightmare while still wearing their shoes, and he carried with him a credibility that you felt in your teeth because he never offered solutions. Only cross-references! And he insisted on patterns rather than prophecy. He introduced a terrifying logic, that the marks in the messages were less like maps and more like stitches in a fabric designed to align certain people at certain moments, and that those alignments had happened before and would happen again. That each person who noticed was both observer and instrument. That memory itself could be layered like wallpaper over an older paper that still bore the impressions of a previous life. When he told Michael, in a message with no attachment and only 3 words, record the nights. It felt less like advice and more like an initiation that no one had a manual for. And yet, billions of small acts of documentation followed. People recording their dreams into phones and mailing paper copies of their nightmares to strangers. As if piling evidence might weight the surreal back into fact, shared symbols became a language of initiation, subtle and maddening in its intimacy. A sideways figure 8 scratched into the paint of a laundromat door. The glyph flattened into the corner of a billboard photograph. A smear on a subway window that, if you traced it with your finger, spelled a date that some claimed matched the day you had nearly chosen a different life. And the act of recognizing the symbol changed you, because recognition felt like complicity. Like a bell you could not unring. Viewers, because that is what they had become. Participants, rather than mere witnesses, started to trade notes the way people trade weather reports, with a ritualized, quiet, posting augmented photos with arrows and circles for one another to decode. Someone would upload a grainy clip of a hospital monitor that, when slowed down frame by frame, suggested the pulse of a second timeline. Another would post an audio file whose spectrogram, when rendered, formed that glyph like a watermark. And suddenly the internet was a gallery of evidence that looked less like proof than like a collective hallucination. But each new item pushed the line further toward the terrifying idea that this was a pattern and not madness, that some force had learned to write itself into the margins of ordinary life. And then the observer appeared, a third, cooler voice, a woman named Claire, who began to send longer, more precise reports. She claimed to have cataloged the glyphs, the dreams, the overlapping and to have cross-checked them against public records and private archives. She spoke like someone who had pored over microfiche until the ink of official denials had thinned into threads. And her files were brutal in their patience, the slow burn of research that turns noise into signal. Claire's reports suggested something worse than coincidence, that the glyph was acting like a filter applied to human memory, a slow algorithm that standardized certain impressions until participants began to repeat the same words and the same gestures across years and distances. She showed them fragments she called convergences. 3 unrelated people waking with the same phrase on their lips. 5 strangers reporting a dream of a porch. Light blinking 7 times 10 photos from different decades where the same scrawled mark appeared at the edge of film. Claire framed these convergences without melodrama, but with a clarity that felt almost surgical. She offered timelines and crosswalks, names and locations. And she asked them to notice how often the symbol turned up at moments of unremembered trauma, how often it accompanied the exact sensation of being watched from inside one's life rather than from outside it. Her conclusion was not a revelation so much as an observation that smelled of iron. It wasn't tea haunting, she wrote, that haunted them. It was intervention, and the interventions had been occurring for as long as anyone could retell. The more people who saw Claire's files, the more the tone of their messages shifted from private horror to communal defense. And yet, that communal defense felt thin and improvised against the thing that refused to be named. They began to create rituals of secrecy, encrypting posts with simple ciphers, embedding that glyph in images that only certain viewers would notice, leaving messages in plain sight that the uninitiated would pass by as trash, and the initiated would read like scripture. And Michael watched as his life became a ledger of exchanges, messages sent and received. Conversations with Henry where the air tasted of old fear. Voice memos that grew from apologetic half-truths to something like doctrine. And through it all, there was a persistent ache of recognition. That human recoil when you realize something in your past has been altered to accommodate a present you only now remembering. The phrase memory glitch was used more and more in those threads, not as an explanation, but as a label, a pin in a map that said, "Be careful here." This place bends. At the end of a week that unspooled like a film running 2 frames at once, a live chat convened with hundreds logged in, and an archive link labeled "What the Government Never Released" pinned to the top. And when Claire and Henry and a cluster of others walked through the documents together on camera, it felt like a tribunal convened not to prosecute but to witness. They played excerpts, grainy tapes, a child's voice saying a name, a weathered man on a bench, turning in a loop of footage that had been recorded in different years, but showed him wearing the same jacket, reading the same page, as if someone had KP'd one life into many. There was relief in that sentence for a second, ridged. Fragile thing, because if you are trapped by a pattern, at least you are trapped with witnesses. But the relief was short-lived, and immediately followed by the deeper, older fear that Claire had hinted at all along. Not only had this thing been watching from the very beginning, it had been studying not only him, but the way humans look when they realize a truth has been withheld. And it had learned to sculpt that realization so that it sanctioned its own persistence. The final image Claire posted before signing off was a photograph of a whiteboard from a meeting that had been redacted, the corners blurred, the center left visible. A series of dates, an array of names, and at the bottom, a single line that read like a plan and not a prophecy. Asterisk. Repeat convergence until stable. There was no judgment in the text, only procedural cruelty. And for a long minute, the live chat did not move, as if 100 people had stood up at once and the world had tilted under them. Then, in little bursts, people began to send messages. Coordinates. Dream logs. The same glyph traced and retraced until the ink smudged. Petitions and post-it notes from strangers declaring they would keep watch for one another. The ending of that night's broadcast arrived like a held breath released when Claire said, with a voice that had finally dropped any pretense of detachment, asterisk, we can see the pattern now, and seeing it changes it. Henry closed with a softer instruction than before. Asterisk, stay together in contact. Do not go alone. Record everything. And in the chat, the phrase, "What the government never released," asterisk, scrolled and re-scrolled until it blurred into a mantra. The camera went dark. The feed ended. But the charge of the room did not dissipate. It multiplied as people left their keyboards and screens and walked into their days with the knowledge that they were not the only ones carrying this particular terrible awareness. Michael sat in the quiet of his apartment, the glyph still floating at the edge of his vision like dust in a shaft of light. And he felt in his gut the thin, electric certainty that this was no longer merely his story or Claire's files or Henry's theorists. It was an emergent network, a congregation of eyes and voices, and whatever had been watching from the beginning had now been watched. The last image that circulated before dawn was a shaky, clandestine photo of a neighborhood cul-de-sac at night, taken by someone who claimed they had been tipped off by coordinates in an old telegram. In the middle of the empty circle of street, the pavement seemed to glisten where a symbol had been painted and then scrubbed it. The scrubbed lines formed the same glyph, but they were broken and scarred like an old wound, and the caption read simply, asterisk, do you see it? Asterisk, underneath. Hundreds replied. Yes, I saw it in my childhood yard. My sister drew it on the bathroom mirror. My neighbor had it carved under his porch steps. And in the final, open space of that thread, someone typed 2 words that landed like a key turned in a lock, opening everything you thought you had learned and making you wonder whether learning had been the trap all along. Asterisk, watch them. Asterisk. The night had a stillness that didn't belong to it. A silence so deep it felt like the walls themselves were waiting for an answer. Aaron stood in the middle of his apartment, surrounded by objects that once held meaning, but now looked like props in someone else's life. He could hear his own breathing, louder than it should be, uneven, as if his body already knew the weight of what he hadn't yet said aloud. The truth had been circling him for days, maybe years, but now it pressed against his ribs with a force that made it impossible to ignore. He wasn't alone in this story, but the worst part was knowing he might have been the one writing it without realizing it. Maya's presence lingered in the room, though she hadn't stepped inside in hours. Her voice still echoed in his skull, sharp and gentle at the same time. Asterisk, you keep asking what happened? You never ask why. It had to happen. Asterisk, That was the sentence he couldn't shake. The one that crawled through his memory with claws sharper than guilt. It wasn't about the vanishing voices, or the recordings that changed when replayed, or even the fragments of dreams he'd woken up clutching like they were evidence from a crime he didn't commit. It was about the question he had never dared to ask himself. Why did he need this mystery to exist? Why did some part of him crave the very thing that was hollowing him out? The apartment lights flickered once, and it felt like a warning. In the reflection of the darkened window, he swore he saw someone behind him, a figure standing too close, leaning forward as though listening. When he turned, there was nothing, only the familiar collapse of shadows across the floor. But the reflection remained burned in his vision. That was the moment he realized something no one had ever admitted. Aloud maybe it wasn't, about the intrusions of some outside force. Maybe the intruder was what lived inside him. He sat on the couch, head in his hands, memories spilling over like a dam breaking. He remembered the library where it started, where Emma had been reading alone, mocked for her solitude, until her book became the one everyone wanted. He remembered how her laughter had cut sharper than his insults, how she had whispered something under her breath when she passed him, words that didn't make sense at the time. And now, replaying that day in his head, the words grew clearer, like a tape rewinding to the one line you were never supposed to catch. You'll learn when it costs you. He hadn't thought much of it then, but now he felt the weight of it, heavy as a prophecy. Every clue he'd gathered, every glitch in the recordings, every slip of memory was in T pointing to what had happened. It was showing him why. Because sometimes life doesn't just wound you, it waits until you've grown, arrogant enough to think you've healed, then rips you open in the same place. His arrogance had been mocking her, laughing at the thing that made her strong. And his punishment had been to lose his grip on the reality that once made him feel secure. The phone buzzed on the table. He almost didn't answer, but his trembling hand lifted it. A voice came through the speaker, low, cracked, like it was traveling from a place that wasn't entirely real. It wasn't Maya. It wasn't Emma. It wasn't anyone he could name. It simply said, asterisk, the story was never about her. It was about what you buried. Asterisk, and then silence. He wanted to throw the phone across the room, but instead, he pressed it to his chest, feeling the vibration of something that no longer existed. The confession rose in his throat, one he had carried for so long it felt like his own blood. He whispered to no one, to everyone. Asterisk, I knew she was right. I just couldn't stand to admit it. Asterisk, tears blurred his vision. He wasn't crying for Emma. He was crying for the boy he used to be. The one who laughed at her. The one who thought words didn't last. That boy had died long ago, and the ghost of him had been haunting every page of this nightmare. The air thickened, as if the room itself was breathing with him. He understood now that the recordings, the glitches, the whispers, none of them were mistakes. They were reminders, warnings, maybe even mercy. The universe didn't want him to uncover what happened. It wanted him to remember why. And that was worse, because remembering meant admitting the darkness wasn't some stranger knocking at his door. It was him. It had always been him. He stood, shaking, staring at the walls that seemed to pulse in and out with invisible waves. The choice came into focus like the sharp edge of a blade. He could accept it, let the truth burn him clean and hollow, or he could deny it, bury it deeper, pretend he was only a victim in a story he never wrote. Either way, there was no going back. A man can survive not knowing what happened, but to know why, that's a wound that never closes. Somewhere, faint and impossible, he heard Emma's voice again. Not mocking, not triumphant, but almost kind. Now you see. And with that, the story no longer felt like one he was reading. It felt like one he had been living without realizing. He opened his mouth, not knowing if the words that came next would save him or damn him, only knowing they could not be taken back. The screen flickers, the sound distorts, and for a moment, everything feels like waking from a dream that had been your life. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for stories you were never meant to hear. Until next time, remember, some truths don't want to be found.